now and see what opportunities are right around the corner from you.
Good morning, everybody. This is Lucas Wendt from ISSA. I am the CMI Training Development Specialist here. First off, I would like to thank everybody for joining us on today's webinar, the leadership webinar, Where Does Your Sales Team Stand in the Industry? A few housekeeping notes before we get started here and let our presenters take over. Feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation to be answered during the Q&A at the end of the session. To submit a question, click on the private tab within the chat area, then double-click Leaders and Assistants, type your question in the bottom text box, and hit Enter. We will put these instructions also in the public area on the chat for you to follow for later on today. But to get us started, I would like to introduce our presenters today. We have Jim Peduto and Dave Frank from KnowledgeWorks. They have combined in the industry, been around for 30-plus years between different careers with contract cleaning companies to distributorships to knowing the industry throughout their entire life. As we get started today, again, feel free to ask any questions throughout. We will answer them at the end of the webinar. But to get us started here, I would like to introduce Jim Peduto and Dave Frank and let them take over.
Good morning. This is Dave Frank. I heard there was a mute off. I hope everybody can hear me. If you can't, please go ahead and put it in the public chat session. We're going to be talking about sales, and we're going to be talking about what's happening within the business climate. And within the cleaning industry, which is obviously the industry that all of us work in, we have a very diverse audience. There are some contract cleaners that are on the call. There are distributors on the call. There are manufacturers on the call. But what we're going to be speaking about in general is the role of salespeople, what's happening with the modern buyer. Some people want to refer to them as the millennial buyer. And so when we look at the business continues to evolve. Some people want to use the word change. Obviously, the word disruption is in a lot of articles that we read. And so the consumer is clearly in the driver's seat, and they're writing a lot of the rules for the way that we're supposed to respond. And so for every problem, trend, issue that we identify as stakeholders within the community, what we have to do is be able to provide a business solution. We must remain relevant, and we can't allow the market forces to marginalize our people, our company, our value proposition. There's a lot at stake. And so business is now moving at the speed of the internet, and no longer can we just stand still. So we're going to go ahead and we'll portray the issues that are facing our business from a sales perspective, and then we'll go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Jim at around slide 10, and then we'll talk about some of those business solutions. We're going to be talking about the disrupted market. We're also gathering data on benchmarking of Salesforce and Salesforce effectiveness. We're looking at the characteristics of salespeople, not in a rearview mirror fashion, but what they need to be relevant in the changing market as they need to have skills for addressing modern buyers. A lot of our clients and people that we talk to in the business will say, I think I know my sales force. Well, thinking that you know your sales force and actually understanding what their DNA is, what their skill sets are, where the gaps in their skills are, is very different from making the statement that I think I know what they're capable of. And there's too much at risk when it comes to that. And so it's not about right or wrong. It's about effectiveness, and it's about results. And so a lot of companies are flat. Some companies are down. And then we've got statistics on integrators and other companies that are up double digit. And so we need to focus on the analysis piece, looking at predictive information, and then being able to put a sensible and affordable action plan in place to potentially help retool or to change the way that our sales forces operate. Okay, selling in the disrupted market. About 4 or 5 years ago, we studied disruption. And disruption, there were articles from the Harvard Business Review and different magazines, and a lot of people were blindsided by disruption. The disruption actually has a flow chart to it. There's actually a pathway as to how companies disrupt marketplaces. And so it's not a topic that people do by accident. So when a competitor wants to enter your world, whether it's a manufacturer, a competing distributor, or if I'm in the contract cleaning business and I'm trying to acquire sales working on different types of market verticals, the way that the disruptor comes into the marketplace is they do a SWOT analysis on the incumbents. They look at their cost models, they look at their value propositions, they look at their websites, and all information is now transparent because of the internet. And so from that information, they then create a new model. Now this new model could be a lower cost structure, it could have a different sales force, and it could have a lower cost to serve, it could be focused on verticals, it could use technology in a different way, it could create business solutions and options. And for many of the leaders that are on this call, you've actually witnessed this in the field. And so it's not something where we can't grab onto it or the document's not in writing. And if there's anybody on this call that would like to see the 5 phases of disruption, we would be more than happy to email it to you. What happens with the incumbents is there's a level of denial or dismissal. And I think a lot of us on this call also owned BlackBerry phones many years ago. They're no longer a factor in the market, so what we sell and who we sell and what industry we're in doesn't really matter. The phases of disruption are fairly generic and they can affect all industries. The most risky piece of this is when companies, their value proposition and their sales force is marginalized or minimized. And then the attempts to come back and to change the way that we approach it are tactical, and those tactical responses many times don't work. And so people want to change prices, they want to change product lines, they want to change a brochure, but it requires a strategic assessment of what's really wrong before we can analyze that and then come up with a solution. The third phase is customer adoption. And so when the customer adopts a new business model or buys from a competitor or is looking at potentially purchasing their cleaning products from Amazon as an example, this is a dangerous place to be because the customer now has a way to compare one business model to another, and then they compare one buying experience to another. And so many of you have Amazon accounts, and you know what that buying experience looks like. Then you go to a retail brick and mortar store, and sometimes as you're standing in line, you wonder why you're here. But you're able to compare one customer experience versus another, one business model versus another. Whether it's wholesale, whether it's retail, doesn't really matter. What happens in the fourth phase is that the reality that the disruptor is now evolving. They're learning the products, they're improving their model, and this disruption creates havoc within the incumbents. And they potentially remove intermediaries from the channel. The tactical responses still aren't effective. Once the incumbent figures out that something is really wrong and they start to say, look, we need to take a closer look at this and not just address this on a tactical or on a street basis, and they accept the market forces. I think denial is a terrible drug in disruption. And so once they accept the market forces, then the sales model can be analyzed, the tools that we use can be analyzed, the type of salespeople that we're hiring may be a different type of salesperson. We may have to redefine our technology, our costs, and then the incumbents can resurface with a competitive business model to potentially compete with somebody who's disrupting. And so disruption is a word that is not just a word, but it's a business philosophy. And when people come in and disrupt markets, trust me, it's not by accident. And many of you on this call have the ability to cause disruption in the marketplace, if you look at it strategically. And when you're looking at it strategically, one of the most important things that you have is your sales model, your sales structure, and the value that your salespeople are providing, because they're the ambassadors for your company and they're the face of what your customer sees. Now, many of you on the call have seen the timeline, and the timeline is not designed to be a scary document. The timeline was designed to map the mergers and acquisitions of contractors and some property management companies and buying groups, some distributor acquisitions. This is a natural effect that occurs in all industries. You could probably do a timeline for automotive. You could do it for the industrial marketplace. You could do it in the electronics industry. And so the purpose of the timeline was to show predictive analysis and to show the community that not only were things changing, but where were they changing and who was causing those changes. And so we don't track the smaller ones, but we do track the larger ones. And what you see in 2017 is the actual inflection point for the disruption in the marketplace. You see manufacturers and you see distributors. You see a lot of movement. You actually see almost 18 individual entries into the timeline in less than 10 months. And we have a few more months to go, and towards the end of the year, we may see some more mergers and acquisitions. The mergers and acquisitions are just reflective of the disruption in the marketplace and the fact that private equity is here and that organizations are going to need to continue to change, to evaluate, and to alter what they're doing. And so this is a strategic document. Some people look at it and they have a tactical position. If they get defensive, then you know that they're tactical. If they analyze it and ask questions, then you understand that they have more strategic thinking. If somebody in the room says, well, an office product distributor can't sell cleaning supplies or Amazon can't sell cleaning supplies, then you know that that's a fairly tactical response. The reason that we discuss tactical versus strategic is that don't ever ask a tactical person to do strategy, and don't ever ask a strategic person to do tactical. They don't go hand in hand. And so that's why the responses can be very dismissive when you're looking at the fundamental changes that happen on the timeline. The timeline is also very much about analyzing. We've analyzed the business models of many of the distributors. We've looked at the demand creation models of some of the manufacturers, and we just understand that change is the only constant in the business climate. And if you need an updated copy of this, if you can connect to us on LinkedIn, or if you want to email us, we would be more than happy to send you that. The timeline does have solutions. Again, we don't want to portray everything as being change, disruptive, or being negative. Everything has a business solution, but the business solution it takes time. It takes some investment. But there are answers to everything in business as it relates to things that are affecting your environment, your people, your company. Okay, here's what's occurred. And I heard somebody say, they said to me, well, the retailers, the whole issue around the retail environment, the Best Buys of the world, the Toys R Us of the world, the Macy's of the world, you know, that's going to evolve over the next 5 years. And I said, no, it's not. I said, it won't take 5 years. And so 11 major retailers have filed for bankruptcy in the last 12 to 18 months, the most recent one being Toys R Us. And so what's happening is the business to consumer, or the B2C shopping experience, is now spilling over to the B2B community. And you have a modern buyer, some people want to call them millennial buyers, that's looking for the same shopping experience. Now, the shopping experience has now become the new competitive landscape. And so when we look at that landscape, the question is what is your buying experience? When I'm working with your salespeople, what is the experience that I get? Is this a product show? Is this somebody coming in to do demos? Is this somebody that's consultative? Do they know my vertical? Do they understand my products? Do they understand my operations? And so a lot of people say, well, you know, our industry is not going to go online. And I said, well, I would like to see it site-based. And I'd like to see it on-site, not online. but there's a lot of experiences that may not be good, they may not be responsive. And so Amazon is a tremendous threat to all industries, and if you looked what happened in the grocery store business, that effect was dramatic. Not because it affected pricing, but because it affected stockholder value. And so this is consistent. This is not going to change. You're not going to convince customers to not compare shopping experiences. The B2C experience is now spilled over into the B2B space. Now, we try to track and we study articles outside of our industry and within our industry. And so this is giving you an example, and somebody had asked me, they said, well, what do you think of the merger of this company and that company? And I told them, I said, look, I'm going to give the conversation about 3 seconds. I said, your company is not prepared to compete with Amazon. And Amazon is one of the single largest threats to all businesses. And no one knows what they sell in the way of commercial cleaning supplies. And most salespeople are not trained. And they're not prepared to address the question. And they may not have the value stack, they may not have the skill sets. And customers aren't going to tell you where they're buying from and why. But this represents the single largest threat to all businesses and all industries, including ours. And so the preparation requires training, it requires education, it requires a look at the model, and it definitely requires a look at actual selling skills. Another verification of the B2C into the B2B world is that the industrial buyer, this is not just affecting our industry. This is affecting automotive. It's affecting trucks, people that buy parts for trucks and cars, and other industries as well. And so when we look at the industrial marketplace, there's a lot of industrial companies outside of our industry, whether it's safety supplies or MROs, that are also having to respond to the B2B spilling over into the B2B space. There's a statement that my business partner Jim made, and we were talking about value. And about 16% of your sales force can sell value, probably 7% actually is consultative. And the scary part is that the sales force is transactional. What we mean by transactional and what we mean by this slide is if the value you provide can be answered online, then it's no longer value. And this is perceived by the customer, not by us. And so let me just explain what these events are. Handing out brochures, doing product demos, training, troubleshooting, and pricing is now available online. You can look at a tent. You can look at an auto scrubber. The leading manufacturers are creating virtual value portals where customers can get information, pricing. So the tactical activities that we're performing as an industry, and other industries are also performing these tactical activities, are now being answered by the internet. And then you have the modern buyer that may not want to talk to a human. And so this is disturbing to a lot of salespeople. We work with some of the top guns of our industry, and some of those top guns have confided in me and said, hey, Dave, I'm being marginalized. And that's a scary thing for talented, highly compensated salespeople to admit. But once we find out what's wrong, then we can figure out the tools, the solution, and the business model or the approach that will stop them from being marginalized by the internet, which is exactly what's happening to many businesses today. And so a lot of people say, well, Dave, this is our role. And I said, I understand it's our role. I understand the activity. The issue is that we report the news. We don't invent it. And so when we're looking at this, the key thing is that you understand what it means to be marginalized and what it means when the value or the activity that your sales force is providing is now being replaced by some other form or some other mechanism. And many of the people on this call have Amazon Prime accounts. Many of you do a lot of research online. I think you understand what we mean when we talk about these actual activities. Okay, well, you guys have heard enough from me about the state of disruption. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jim Peduto. Jim Peduto is a friend of mine and my business partner. We've known each other for over 30 years. He's an all-around great guy, and he's made major contributions not only on this subject, but other subjects within the commercial cleaning industry. Jim, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, partner. I appreciate it very much. Dave did a great job, as he always does, kind of setting the table and pointing out where we are and how the business is changing. And to kind of underscore, you know, our businesses have changed, and selling in general, particularly business-to-business selling, has changed dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years. And there's two important ways that it's changed. One, and the first, is the seller capability. Salesperson who was good at building relations 10 years ago was successful. 10 years ago, the only thing they needed to do was to build a good, strong relationship, build trust, credibility, show they care, and that would have been enough. Today, it's not enough, but you can't sell without it. We are now, in the current environment, what we refer to as sales DNA, 6 skills that kind of hinder or help execute strategy are more crucial than ever. And they're crucial because selling's more difficult. It's harder to reach decision makers. It's important to take a consultative approach. Not only important, it's essential to take a consultative approach. And that consultative approach needs to occur in order that we differentiate so that we can show and demonstrate to the customer why we're a better value proposition. So we needed a degree of sales DNA that wasn't even thought about 10 years ago. And in addition to that, and probably just as important as DNA, is grit. Grit's important because without the grit, or the will to sell, what I'd call heart, you can't improve and you can't get better at your craft. And the challenge is both DNA and grit are competencies that are very hard to just observe in your sales force. Kind of building on Dave's point that many people think they know their sales force. Well, a lot of the things that make salespeople successful and not successful are not necessarily observable. The second aspect and way that selling is difficult is that it's far harder now. There's much more competition. You know, when I was started in the business, when Dave did, when many of you did, we kind of knew who our competition was. Now competition can come from anywhere. Where we might have had local competition, now you have global competition. You have competition from non-traditional sources, whether it's an integrator, whether it's online, whether it's somebody entering our marketplace, as the timeline shows. Because of all that competition, there's much more pressure on pricing. Buyers are much more concerned about low price, and that necessitates salespeople who are really, really, really good at selling consultatively. And as David mentioned, a very small percentage of salespeople have that capability. So when you look at the evolution of how we've got to where we are in terms of selling value and how it breaks down, it's very, very, very interesting. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, we invented the idea of a unique value proposition, and that was a differentiator. That was the thing that would differentiate our company from everybody else in the market, and it was essentially a marketing effort. It was a set of words that we wanted people to associate with us and our value. Then, after a while, everyone had a value proposition, and so it was no longer a differentiator. So the next logical step was the value add. The value add was the thing that we would uniquely do above and beyond what you were paying us for, and that would differentiate us from our customer. Well, now, the early 21st century, and everybody has a value add, and today, the value is in us. The value is in the salesperson. Today, we need to be the value. And for us to be the value, we can't sell the way we sold 10 years ago because the prospects don't need us for that. Customers have access to any piece of information or pricing they need in just a couple of clicks on Google. And it's right on the screen. So a salesperson who's going to provide what's on Google or what's on the internet is redundant and essentially useless. Hence the saying or the phrase that we used earlier that if the value you provide can be answered by the internet, it isn't value. So what does it look like to be the value? Well, to be the value, we're over on the far left of this of this slide, excuse me, far right of the slide. Far left is where we started, obviously. Far right, consultative seller. What's a consultative seller do? In order to be the value, we have to be able to ask great questions. We have to have a difficult, challenging conversation that our prospect hasn't had with anybody else. And as a result of that conversation, they need to learn something they didn't know. They need to change their thinking in some way. And most importantly, they need to come to the conclusion that we get it, that we get their business better than anybody else, and we have the solutions to be able to help them. That's a difficult way to sell. The consultative approach is where we're asking a lot of questions and we're selling value by being the value. It's very hard to do, but it leads to easier results. And at the heart of that are those characteristics that are not necessarily discernible or observable. And as Dave mentioned, and is shown up on the screen now, only about 7% of salespeople have that consultative selling capability. A little greater percentage, about 16%, can actually sell on value. And the vast majority, say 3 out of 4 of your sales team, are probably in the product seller mode and have that capability. And so what we're going to spend some time talking about is what are some next logical steps and where do we take this and where do we go and what's the solution to the challenge? What's the solution to the disrupted market that we're all confronted with and facing on a day-in, day-out basis? Well, the first step is to build awareness. And certainly the timeline and the ideas and concepts that David so eloquently laid out are the starting point, right? We need to be aware of the timeline and the competitive forces that are out there. The next step is to benchmark your sales force. And understood in the proper context, we want to differentiate from the things that you can do to get an immediate impact right now versus the things that will take a little longer time. Benchmarking a sales force is an issue of survival. And I would contrast that with the secondary issue, which is more strategic, which is thinking about maybe acquisitions or product expansions, or something that's going to take even longer, which is succession planning and exit strategies. With sales force effectiveness or benchmarking your sales force, you get immediate impact. It's the single most important thing you can do, and it has to happen before everything else because, as this graphic shows, it's foundational. By answering the questions from a sales force benchmark, a sales operational benchmark, you'll learn a whole bunch of things about your business. And I can tell you from an experience standpoint, from an objective standpoint, from a put to practice and use in all the companies that we've worked with perspective, that nothing gets things started or positions you more effectively for success. And if the second step in your process is benchmarking the sales force, then you'll identify and be able to use that information to identify who needs to be trained and how. And once they're effectively trained and can effectively use consultative tools, you can deploy them. And then you can come back and measure the improvement both in terms of their effectiveness and what your bottom line looks like. So let's just look at a couple of things that happen when you benchmark the sales force. When we benchmark the sales force, we answer some critical questions. And when you evaluate your sales force the right way, for the right reasons, at the right time, it means that you're looking at your people, your systems, your processes, your strategies. And when you do that, you're going to get the answer to these 4 big questions. Why aren't we more effective than we currently are? How much more effective could we be? How much will it take to accomplish it? And how long will it take? And you're going to answer a whole bunch of other questions. How many of our existing salespeople can make the transition from presenting, proposing, and chasing to being the value? Which of our salespeople are able to make the transition and can be counted on to be more proactive at hunting and closing this year? What impact is my sales management team having on the organization? Are they doing the right things? If not, why not? Is there enough coaching? Enough time spent on the right things? Do my sales managers really spend time coaching, or do they spend time selling? Am I bringing the right people into my organization? Here's an acid test. Can you hire somebody and get them to the top half of your sales force in 12 months? If not, it's a reflection on the sales selection, onboarding, and coaching. If you have sales strategies, can your sales force execute those strategies? And if not, what has to change? Is it the sales force, the strategies, a little of both? Which of the salespeople that you have are underperforming? In most companies, more than half the sales force is underperforming and not consistently overachieving, which means a big question has to be asked. Can they be saved? If they can be saved, what has to happen to get there? We also know that the best bang for the buck comes from developing people who are already succeeding because they've already taken time to learn strategies. They're already showed an inclination to develop skills and get better at what they do. And there's probably a whole bunch of very personal and specific questions about your sales organization, systems, and processes that need to get answered. What do we need to do? What do we need to change? What has to move? What are the gaps? How do we fill the gaps? How long would it take? What's the return? All that comes from evaluating a sales force. And when we look at a sales force and begin the evaluation process, you're really going to focus on three areas. You're going to focus on the people and their skills, the infrastructure that's there to support them, and the infrastructure includes the strategies, alignment to the strategies, the systems, the processes that you use, and what type of training development needs to occur to be able to fix both the above, and not only fix, but be able to leverage the strengths that you probably already do have. So there's three major areas of focus. It's more than just people. It's infrastructure, processes, systems, and training. All those things need to work in concert with one another in order to be effective. When you benchmark your sales force, you're typically going to look at three things. You're going to look at the will to sell. Those are kind of the grit issues that I talked about, right? Does my sales team have desire, commitment, a positive outlook, the requisite level of motivation, and are they essentially trainable? Secondly is DNA. Those are a group of 6 characteristics that either help or hinder the execution of sales success. They're highly correlated with sales achievement, and then and they're not observable either. So between will to sell, where there's 5 characteristics, DNA, there's another 6, that's 11. You've got another 10 characteristics that are tactical. Tactical are things like, can I hunt, qualify, use a sales process, close effectively, present at the right time under the right circumstances, the things that we traditionally teach in sales training. And then the fourth piece that you'll round it out with are client-specific attributes, things that are unique to your organization about how you manage your team, how you go to market, and how you're structured for success. And the evaluation of those 4 items gives you very clear and concise insight into where the opportunities exist and what needs to occur in order to compete in a disruptive environment. I want to share just a couple of specific examples that are taken from a sales force of effectiveness that I think underscore and highlight what you'll see. One of them is, what are the questions is, what are our current sales capabilities? And so we talked about being the value, the need to truly be consultative and or at the very least sell value. What we're showing here is where your organization, which would be the one in burgundy, stacks up against similar organizations, which are other ISSA industry firms, and all organizations, meaning the entire world of sales. We work with a database that includes over 1 million salespeople from 12,000 companies tracked for over 20 years. So, it's pretty robust, and we can give you you can get a pretty clear insight through ISSA of how consultative your team really is. And when we talk about consultative selling and we've identified where their capabilities are in the aggregate, you could drill down further and say, when we're talking about consultative selling, what's that really mean and what's it look like? Well, consultative selling, along with all the other traits and characteristics and attributes that you'd look at in a Salesforce assessment, including the processes, systems, etc., all are broken out and detailed out like they're shown on this screen. So when we're talking about consultative selling, we're talking about these attributes. That a consultative seller is somebody that's able to listen and ask questions with ease, that are able to uncover issues, ask tough questions, ask great questions, takes nothing for granted, understands how prospects will buy, builds the relationship, and presents at the appropriate time. So when we talk about consultative selling, we're not talking about it, nor should you ever be talking about it in the abstract. You should always be talking about it in measurable attributes that can be quantified, trained to, and then remeasured to determine whether you're moving people and your organization in the right direction. And again, this is just one example of over 100 that you look at when you benchmark a sales force. And when you benchmark a sales force and you come away with an understanding that includes, well, these 13 and a whole bunch of other really critical aspects of your business. You know, we talk about the 21 competencies. Those include the will to sell competencies, sales DNA, and the tactical competencies. What's your top performer look like? Everybody has a vision in their mind of what a successful salesperson may or may not look like in their environment. What they don't necessarily have is a profile to which you can actually measure and hire to. And so if you want to bring top performers into an organization or build an organization of top performers, it's pretty critical that you have a definition of what that actually looks like. And of my current team, who can sell and who's trainable, and at what kind of training are they going to need to get there where they need to be, and who can hunt, who can farm, who ought to be an account manager. Kind of from Collins, right? Do I have the right people and the right seats in the bus? And along with competencies like, are we comfortable talking about money with customers, because that's the foundation of all consultative selling. If we can't comfortably talk about their business and business aspects, it's pretty tough to be a trusted business advisor. How quickly can I ramp somebody up? I mentioned earlier, if we're not ramping up and getting people on board and to the top half of the sales force in 12 months, we're doing something wrong. Do I have a meaningful pipeline, or is the pipeline really just a reflection of bloat and the fact that we haven't proactively managed it and we've just let opportunities kind of move down? You know, these are just a handful of the organizational issues that you'll identify, and they extend to not only the salespeople, but sales management, and of course the infrastructure that supports the entire sales apparatus. So it's, you know, in terms of deliverables, it's tangible. It can be put to use immediately, and as we showed earlier, it's really foundational. If you're going to make the commitment that the business is going to thrive and you're going to prosper in 2018, and you're going to compete in this more difficult than ever environment, it begins by taking a look at your sales operation, your sales organization, and what's there. Because whether you want to talk about changing your comp program, or what lines you're going to carry, or whether you need to add a new program or roll out this tool, all of it's predicated on the success of a sales team and people that are capable of positioning themselves and your company to a changing customer in a new and modern, better way. So if to do that, to be able to succeed, ISSA has been pretty innovative and creative. They've created a program for Salesforce benchmarking so that the data is available to you, obviously, to be able to see how your peers are doing, but at the same time, be able to take a picture at a broader context and see how your organization stacks up, not only to the industry, but to best in class. because you need to be best in class to be able to succeed and to be able to prosper in this type of environment. There's a bunch of next steps that you can take. Some are really easy, and some are a little more challenging. We thought it'd be easy to kind of go 1, 2, 3 in the context of the continuum that we built that outlines how you compete in a disruptive market. First step is decide whether you want to compete or maintain the status quo. Status quo was always a strategy. I guess there's nothing wrong with it. Some people adopt it. A lot of other people decide they want to compete and they want to prosper. Look, both are viable strategies. There's nothing wrong with having a lifestyle business. Many people do that. Other people have a different end game in mind. So that's probably a threshold issue. The second is, if you want to do something that's quick, cheap, easy, and doesn't involve any cost, there's a link on the screen that gives you a free Salesforce grader. It's only about 20 questions, and it kind of just lets you take your Salesforce's temperature. It doesn't take a whole lot of time, doesn't take a whole lot of effort, but just gives you some pretty quick and immediate feedback into where your Salesforce probably fits along a continuum. Based on how you view that, you may or may not want to benchmark your sales team, your strategies, and your systems. That's certainly up to you, but it's obviously there through ISSA with ISSA's buying power and everything else that goes along with that. So decide what works for you, where you want to be 5 years from now, or what success looks like. Take a free look at your Salesforce at a super high level, and then decide if a next step makes more sense for you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lucas for any questions that we've collected along the way.
Thank you there, Jim. Also want to thank you, Dave, for the presentation today in the webinar. So getting into it now, we had a few people throughout the session ask some questions. These will be for both you, Jim, and Dave. The first question is, does this mean that if we have reps that are not teachable, trainable, that we should terminate them, or do we develop around them?
Well, that's a great question that comes up all the time. Look, my family used to own a sanitary supply distributor, and I still remember the reps that weren't really performing the way they should be. And I'm sure the last thing that we would have ever done is take them out and line them up against the wall and shoot them. So I'm not sure that that's a strategy. But the fact is that all organizations have people that are underperforming. And I think as leadership, it's our responsibility to help people be successful. And so if you have people that are underperforming, the question is, what can we do to move them along, right? Where are their gaps? And there's two kinds of underperformers. There's underperformers that are meeting plan, but they're just not achieving what you'd like them to. And there's underperformers that are kind of chronic and cost you money. And I think it's important to begin by distinguishing those two. Certainly everybody should be given an opportunity to improve and to get better at what they're doing. But if we know that somebody looks like they have the propensity not to want to be trainable, and they're not performing, I think you need to give them a chance to succeed, but understand that you're probably going to give them the chance to succeed with the hope and the full commitment of the organization that you're going to help them be successful. And if you make that commitment and they're still not successful, then at that point, for those few individuals that aren't choosing to step up and aren't choosing to get engaged, maybe sales isn't the best thing for them. But what you do know is that your high performers don't want to be on the sales team with people that are weak. So I think it's and the folks that we've worked with, there's been a lot more people, a vast number more people that have moved up rather than moved out.
Perfect. Thank you, Jim. Another question that just came in, where is the best place to find good salespeople?
The best place, well, I guess if we're having a dialogue, the first question I'd say is what's great or what's best, right? If you don't know what that is, if you don't know what the characteristics of your best salespeople are that differentiate them from the weaker people on your team. If you don't know what a profile looks like that can give you over 90% predictive validity of who's going to be successful, I think you're hoping. So assuming that we know that, we know what we're looking for, the question is, where do we go get it? And, there's a couple of places that you can go. There's obviously the broad answer is, right, you can post Indeed, you can post to ZipRecruiter, you can do all that kind of thing. But if you don't have a tool that lets you filter all those applications out, it's pretty hard. The good news is there's tools that let you do it with high predictive validity. A better approach is to know what those characteristics are and then start looking within your networks. And within your networks, I don't necessarily mean from competitors or lateral moves. All of you call on people that other salespeople call on, and they may be from other disciplines, but they call on the same decision makers. What I tell clients all the time, talk to your decision makers who you trust and you have a good relationship with, and ask them who the standout salespeople that call them are. Now, they may not be from our industry, but they may be an HVAC person, they may be a security person, they may be a faster person, they may be selling some other product group. Look, there's only going to be, percentage-wise, we know that the elite salespeople are a small percentage. Think of your own world, right? How many people do you know that call on you or that you've worked with personally that are truly elite? So when you ask somebody who's already buying, who's in our market, in a facility manager role, for example, who are the great salespeople that call on you? Well, they're going to give you a couple of names, and those are the people you need to go out and start trying to build a relationship and start trying to recruit. Because if you just cast a wide net, it's tough. If you're focused, just like it is on your marketing program, you're going to be more successful. So I think it requires that the same type of creativity and energy that you put into a marketing program needs to be put into recruitment. And what we see most often is that people only recruit when they need to fill a position, not as a part of how they do business.
Thanks, Jim. Another question that came in was, what do you recommend our first steps be in setting up a sales process? And the question came in from a service contractor.
Okay. Well, I think, whether it's a service contractor or whether it's, whether you're selling a service or whether you're selling a product, and I think I'd make the argument there's pretty big overlap there, because right now the way we're selling products really needs to look more like you're selling a service anyway. But, every organization is going to have a somewhat unique sales process. I think the first step in every sales process would be to, and you get this as part of a Salesforce benchmark, is to evaluate the effectiveness of your current process. Does it work? If it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? What's it going to take to fix it? Is the process yielding results that we expect? It results in terms of sales growth, results in terms of predictive analysis. That if I've got a process and do I really understand the process well enough to be able to say that if I put 100 people to the top of the process, it takes 100 calls to get an appointment, and of 100 appointments, it takes half of those generate a first meeting, and of those, 1 out of 3 is actually qualified, and 1 out of 6 of those is actually closable. I mean, is my process telling me that, and is it telling me information that I can use to modify the process or change it so that it can be more effective? If you haven't benchmarked your Salesforce, your systems, and your processes, one of which is that selling process, it's pretty tough to know where to begin and where to go. So, I'm kind of analytical, and I think it works pretty well to before you start taking action, get a baseline or benchmark as to where you are and where do things stand, because that almost always tells you what needs to be moved.
Thanks, Jim. A couple other questions before we end this webinar. These kind of fall in line. what are the deliverables of evaluating your sales force?
Okay. The first and probably the most important is an assessment of the sales organization, which we said earlier includes the people, processes, and training needs. And that includes a upside calculation, meaning you'll know how much more the current sales team can generate, how long it will take, and what it will take. And assess, so that's number one. Number two, an assessment of the leadership in terms of current capabilities, time commitments, and whether or not they're additive to the sales equation. Individual reports for everybody who takes the assessment, both salespeople, sales leadership as well, and a half-day consult with us to be able to review the results.
All right. The last couple questions we have here, this one is going to be, how do we make sure our KPIs do not influence our sales results in a wrong way?
But one of the things that, kind of singing from the same playbook here, but one of the things that you identify when you do the sales force benchmark is an analysis of your systems and processes. Part of the analysis of your systems and benchmarks spends quite a bit of time analyzing the KPIs that are currently in use and whether or not those KPIs are consistent with what we know to be the best practices in terms of KPI measurement of a sale, of KPI and metric measurement for a sales force. So, you know, I think the starting point again there is let's compare your metrics to what you know best in class looks like. And maybe you've got some metrics that no one's ever thought of before and they're an unbelievably great idea. And maybe there's some metrics that everybody who's pretty successful are using that you need to adapt. And so I think, you know, through that process of, again, benchmarking what you currently have, see how it compares to best in class, and then making a determination in terms of gap analysis is probably the most effective thing that you're going to do to figure out whether your KPIs are additive or whether they're counterproductive or some combination thereof. But there's some pretty clear metrics that we know good sales teams evaluate and know on a regular basis, and I think there's like about 20 of them. So it's pretty specific, and I think that'd be a good starting point.
Perfect. Thanks, Sir Jim. One last question. It's kind of in two parts. What are the steps involved in the Salesforce evaluation, and how long does it take to complete the evaluation?
Okay. Let's kind of bang those off real quick. First is obviously a commitment. Typically a commitment from senior leadership. Look, this is something we're going to put the time and energy into. Two, there's a questionnaire that would need to be completed by the reps and the sales leadership. Questionnaire takes about 45 minutes, done online. There's management questionnaire, about the same thing, and that talks about systems, processes, strategies. That takes about an hour for senior management. And communicated to the salespeople. Then we'll do some analysis of those results. We'll develop a report that's probably about 150 pages, presentation deck that's another 40, and then spend half a day going over it. So those are the steps. It's essentially commitment, some online questionnaires, and some conversations with senior leadership, and that process takes between 3 and 4 weeks.
Perfect. Thanks there, Jim. So to close this out, some last housekeeping notes. We had several questions regarding this. We will be sending out a link to the presentation and a recording of this webinar later today or tomorrow for everybody that registered and attended today. So you will have access to everything that we went over today. Lastly, I'd like to thank Jim and Dave for this presentation today and taking their time out of the day to help us learn on this particular tool that ISSA is offering. If anybody has any questions regarding the tool, or if it came up afterwards when you're thinking about it, reviewing the recording, please feel free to contact us here at ISSA. Your main contact for that is going to be TJ Grimm, and his email address is going to be tj@issa.com. And again, we'll be sending this out. And lastly, again, thank you very much, Jim and Dave.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you very much.